today. And I apologize because how I have it on present mode, I can't see you, but there is somebody here that is from the staff, and they will be monitoring the chat feature. So if you have any questions or anything like that, please just put them in the chat, and then we'll probably end a little bit early, so we'll have some time to go through those questions if you have any. So today's session is Data Meetings at Work. Again, my name is Kara Watkins, and I'm the SIG Data Strategist for Dayton Public Schools. So in my role currently, I support schools reviewing data weekly. I provide support with implementing instructional strategies, and I also support the curriculum and instruction team as well. SIG schools are the schools that are identified in the School Improvement Grant. So they tend to be a little more intensive, and they tend to have more data points that occur more often throughout this school year. Prior to that, I worked 3 years as an instructional coach in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was an elementary literacy coordinator, elementary school admin, and then prior to all that, I taught 4th through 8th grade in elementary and middle school levels. So just a little about my background today. So our overview, essentially what we're going to be looking at is, our agenda. We'll be diving into data questions, something that I feel really helps do data meetings and make them effective, as well as logistics. So, when we're planning our data meetings, there are things that are just kind of those non-negotiable things that we have as a result of building a district. How do we work around those to continue to have effective data meetings? And then the next best step. So we take all this information, what should we think about first, as far as implementing to go in for our, data meetings next year, however that might look, and begin to make some effective changes with our data. So I want to kind of start off dispelling some data omens, especially at the school level. We have like this thing of what we get.
Could I interrupt really quick?
Yes.
Sorry. I'm not sure if everybody's muted. Some of us are having a hard time hearing.
Okay.
Can everybody check to make sure that they're muted? Thank you.
All right, very good. Thank you for that. So kind of looking at data meetings and kind of dispelling some of the omens around it, especially as data leads, we kind of see both. And if we were in the classroom, we kind of got to see it on both hands, right? So, it's just what we get versus what we want idea. We want teachers to be prepared to dive into student data. What we end up having is teachers who become defensive and shut down because of the data. Really want teachers to be reflective and responsive, but we get teachers who don't even look at the data. And then we, have this time sketched out in our schedule to have data meetings. So we want to use this time effectively, but the data meetings end up becoming staff meetings and ranting sessions, and we never get to address the data meeting today. So I feel like these are the things that we're kind of up against when we talk about data meetings, particularly at the school level. And so my goal today is really to kind of shake some of the negative thoughts around it in order to get to a stronger, more effective data meeting. And this is really we want our data meetings to become. We want them to become an atmosphere for reflection and growth, for it to be a safe space for teachers and leaders. I think that's so important now, because our data is plastered everywhere. It's used a lot of times to make a lot of different determinations around students and teachers. And so, we want it to be safe. We want teachers to be genuinely engaged and thoughtful about their practice. And ultimately, I just can't say it again, but a no judgment zone, right? So this first activity I have for you is really just a reflection. And it's thinking about your current data meetings now. So I'm not sure if you are a data lead who is going into schools and supporting data meetings, if you are admin who is trying to run data meetings, whatever your role is and however you are using data meetings currently. I want you to think about the barriers and the roadblocks that you currently have. And I think sometimes in order to move forward, we have to really think about where we are, what we have, and then how can we move forward. Then the second part of this reflection is, what would you like to see? What would you like to see change? Or what would you like to see your data meetings look like? And that could be something that is completely different than where you are now. But we want to kind of create a reflection moment to think about where we are, honestly, and then where we would like to go. So it says 5 minutes, but I just kind of want to give you a couple of minutes just to jot down some of your answers to those questions. If you haven't already, start now using the remainder of the time to think about what you would like to see. And so now here's your turn to talk. If you would like to unmute yourself and just share out what you wrote down, maybe what's a barrier and then what's something that you would like to see.
This is Susan Larson, and I believe a barrier is a lack of buy-in or belief in the data and threat and fear that comes along with that.
This is Becky Bowling. I would agree with that fully and would like to also mention that the barrier is time. Teachers will tell us the barrier is time in the school day to sit down and also to try to get vertical data teams more focused in on like subject area, a math teacher group from vertically through the grade levels, focusing on their data together with that time allowed for that.
I agree.
I think along with time, this is Christy Graves. One of the things that I see is that need for shared leadership and getting them to take ownership, building capacity within teams so that way those conversations don't always rely on us. We have data protocols, things in place that kind of guide the work.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Lisa Blackwell. One of the things that I think about is that we need to commit to changing adult actions as a response to what we see in the data. Just stop looking at it and we actually have to do something with it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those of you who shared out. I agree with you. Everything that was said, yeah, I think that there is a lot of fear that happens with these data meetings. Time in the day, always, especially with vertical planning, takes a unique schedule that I do agree that sometimes we in our positions don't have the opportunity to work through admin with a lot. So I definitely agree with that. Christy, your shared leadership comment, hopefully we're able to speak to that a little bit later on today. And then, yes, looking at these adult actions and then, moving to like doing something, instead of just kind of continuing to talk about it. So yeah, thank you for those of you who shared out with your barriers. I appreciate that. I think that some of that will be able to address today, and then just create some conversations as well for some other things moving forward. So the first thing that we're going to kind of talk about here when we look at our data meeting is our agenda. If everyone can make sure they're back muted. I agree that an agenda sometimes just seems obvious. And sometimes it's so obvious that we forget about it. But I think it's very important component of your data meetings because it really is the roadmap for your meeting. It sets your expectations. It creates an opportunity for accountability for all parties involved. And then it allows us to, track the goals as we're working to achieve them. So your agenda really kind of hits on a couple of different things. What I've kind of learned just from being in the classroom in admin and in kind of this seat now are some like do's and don'ts with agendas, right? So allow it to be that roadmap that I was talking about earlier. Be purposeful in your creation and then also your delivery as well. You don't want it to just become like a checklist. Because when it's just a checklist, we want to check things off and then toss it out, right? Because that's the sense of accomplishment. But we really want it to become, if you will, like a portfolio that we are saving agendas and we're able to go back and see, oh, what did we do 2 weeks ago? What did we do a month ago? And how have we moved the dial from that first meeting to where we are now? With that in mind, it brings this idea of agendas being cyclical, right? So it's a cycle that we are continuing to create with our data meetings. So we want to make sure that whatever the action step is for data meeting 1 is revisited data meeting 2. And same thing, so we keep like a cycle of things going. I'm thinking, just trying to go through. I do believe that the agenda should be sent out in advance of the meeting. There are times when I've sat in meetings and agendas are just being handed out beforehand. And I just think about how deep are we really going to dive when the participants of the meeting don't even know what's going to happen in the meeting until they sit down. So that's something to think about, something to consider. And I think that's just kind of taking your agenda to the next level. Your agenda should not be, and I got you, right? Keep it open, expectations, everything is just open and free. Like I said, don't hand out the agenda at the time of the meeting. I just think that that's a practice that it just is not, it's not as deep and enriching. And then also don't not have an agenda. I just think that when we don't have agendas, we have no roadmap, we have no guideline, so we don't know what we're doing. And you see that typically in teams that are very comfortable. And you also will see that in teams that are high functioning, right? And so that's really good. We love our high functioning teams. We love our teams that are very comfortable and familiar with each other. But even still, we want to continue to push practices. We want to continue to dive deeper. We still want our meeting time to be effective. And so because we're so comfortable and fluid, because we work so well together, we don't need agendas, but we do. So that's something, a different push there. I've 2 examples of data meetings, agendas that I typically like to use and follow and go back. The one to the left is from Uncommon Schools, Paul Bambrick Santoya, Leverage Leadership. This is really, really great when you're thinking about an analysis meeting, when you're diving into your your data points, when you're diving into instructional practices. What I love about this agenda to the left is that it starts with prep work, right? And so that speaks to having your agenda in advance. What is the leader bringing and doing? What are teachers bringing and doing? And sometimes when it's written out there, I think it's an opportunity to hold everybody accountable, not just my teachers who are expected to bring binders and points and student samples, but also me. This is what I'm bringing too. Sometimes I think that when we are out of the classroom and in a different role, what we do is not always seen, and so it's assumed that we're not doing anything, but we are doing a lot and sometimes almost too much. And when you put it out there as far as the prep work for both parties, I think that it just kind of creates an even playing field for everybody. Always starting with praise. I think that's important. And we don't do enough of praise or even celebrations in the data. What I love about the rubric to the left is that it gives you the prompts for it, right? So congratulations on the improvement from last time. Being specific with praise. I enjoy being praised. I like it better when my name is in it, and then when I'm told exactly what I'm doing, and how I've done it well. When it's general, y'all are great. That's a praise, right? But when it's specific, Christy, you did a great job last week monitoring your students for their exit tickets. That's more personal. So just thinking about that as well when you're thinking about your praise or celebration. In the middle, there's a probe on the analysis. And this is the meat and potatoes of the agenda right here. This is where we get down to the dirty. There's some opening probes, right? Some group level or like wide focus probes. And then there are in-depth probes. What I will say to that, just because typical time in a day for data meetings, give a good general opening probe and then maybe one in-depth probe and then go from there. If you are intentional, right, and you are planned prior to your meeting, you can get to where you need to be in 2 or 3 questions. Your opening probe question could even be something that you send out on your agenda when you're sending it early. Hey team, data meeting this week. These are things you should bring. This question I want you to think about and be prepared to answer prior to our meeting. Goes back to accountability, right? And then it also kind of is like a great way to use your time and manage your time, because you're kind of giving them half the work before they even come in. Finally, planning your actions. I don't think that we always get to that part. And that's just because we typically run out of time. So really making sure that your probe is not too long, that you're able to then plan your actions, and then your follow-up. I like the planning and actions and follow-up together, because that's where you are now creating specific, pinpoint either directions or moves that I can go into your classroom and see you implementing. I think a lot of times our follow-up and our action steps are not exact. I think they are very broad because there's always a lot of them, right? Like we're just like, oh my gosh, okay, you need to do this, that. Pick the highest leverage. Think about it, ask the teacher, get the teacher input. What do you see that you're able to implement this week or within the next 2 weeks of your data cycle? What do you feel comfortable? This is what I would like to do. Get that feedback together so it's more of a team effort than you as the leader telling them. And that also kind of just creates an opportunity for a better follow through. The agenda to the right is something that I've kind of created as well, just off of this Uncommon Schools, but then also I think kind of more so what works with my teachers and what's worked with the districts that I've been in. So I tweak it every year, I feel, but these are my components that I have. Assessment, right? So we're reviewing the assessment. This is really general, but I just also have to say it because it's happened so many times that we are all common on what assessment we are reviewing for the data meeting. I can't tell you how many times I've come into data meetings and there are just, multiple assessments from various content areas that are all out on the table. Have an assessment in mind, have a plan in place with that, and just make sure that that is clear. Seems very obvious, but I can't tell you how many times I've done that and seen that happen. So, you have identified your assessment, and then I have some questions there that will kind of guide your review on that. The analysis part, identify what data points will be used, test in hand, deep analysis. There's a lot of different data points that we have. So just making sure that that is clear and stated as well. Examining. I just also think that, teachers don't always examine and look through their data beforehand. We get it. So even in those parts B and C, I've just tried to create time in the data meeting. It's not best, it's not ideal, but even if I can take 5 minutes and say, hey, just look over this exact thing, that's been helpful, and I've won some gains with teachers there. Action, once again, kind of your action steps. What are you doing? Planning for it. The accountability, how are we engaging students through this process? That's something that's really big. And then finally, culture, and it's kind of cut off there. But this is important in a lot of our schools. And I don't think that we bring it up enough in our data meetings, but how can we sustain the work that we're doing in the school? Our school culture also affects what we do with our data. And so, is it bringing in people from the leadership team? Is it creating, like a school calendar that outlines data? What are we doing that is, engaging the greater school culture as a whole as well with some of our data points? So I just think that that's something as well that's important to bring out. So quick activity for you. I would like for you to create an outline for a meeting agenda. What are your must-haves, and then what are your want-to-haves? So for me, my must-have is reflection questions. My must-have is a celebration. I want to have, some reflective moments for teachers to do some reflective writing and journaling. I would love to have that. That would be my ideal, but I know that time and does not always yield to that. And then I also know that, journaling and reflecting is also like something that's a characteristic or a personality thing. Not everyone's going to want to sit and write about their data. So I kind of get that too. So that's an example for you of some must-haves versus some want-to-haves. Take a few minutes if you don't mind, and just jot down what are your outline for a meeting agenda, and then think about what are your must-haves and your want-to-haves. if you haven't already, begin to think about what your must-haves and want-to-haves are, and just kind of use the remainder of the time to jot down your must-haves and your want-to-haves. And again, I'm going to ask you if you're okay with unmuting yourself. I'm interested in learning about your want to haves. That always kind of gets my gears going and just kind of thinking about how we can add some of these want to haves in our data meeting. So if you don't mind sharing out, I would love to hear what your want to haves are.
Again, this is Susan, and I really want the participants to self-discover in the data.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
This is Jackie, and kind of going off on what you said, Kara, as well as Susan. I think sometimes that self-discovery can happen through reflective or positive presupposition prompting questions. So even if the educator is not doing exactly what maybe the thought process should be, you can prompt them to think, if you were doing this, what could be the results?
Mm-hmm.
So this is Susan. I would like some goal setting with success criteria, just in order to align what their appropriate actions are going to be, and then use that measure at the next data cycle, but also discuss how will that action be supported.
That is good. Yes. Yes, I second that, Susan, as well. I see that like being next steps for a lot of teams sometimes, and just making sure that we're able to then get into that gracefully and then effectively as well. So I definitely support that as well. And thank you again for your reflection, for your comments, reflection, self-discovery. I agree; those are always the best moments. That makes all the work worth it when you get when you get those light bulbs and aha moments. So I agree with you as well. Thank you so much. I'll give you guys a second to mute yourselves back if you haven't already done so. And we'll move into kind of one of my favorite parts of the data meeting, which are your data questions. I think that some of those want to haves that we aspire for our teams can come out of this when it's done properly. And I have to say properly because what I've learned as an instructional coach is that delivery from me is just as important for just as important as my expectation for the teachers or the expectations for the team. How I send it off, how I set it up is just important for how teachers are going to receive it, how teams will receive it, and then how they're able to carry on the work. And just because we know that, once again, data is one of those things that it can be really fragile and it can be a tough topic for a lot of people to talk about. We want to make sure that our questions are not aggressive and attacks, but really moments of reflection and inquiry. So this is something that I've been working on, and I tell you, each year, each team, I feel like I'm growing and strengthening my muscle and delivering with data questions. But I think it's something important to consider when you're doing your data meetings. Like I said before, you really have to kind of plan and prepare these questions before you release them. And the biggest reason that it is because of time constraints. You want to pick questions that are going to, get the teacher who never talks to use more than 2 words to answer. And then you want to ask the question that the teacher who always talks will get right to the specifics. And so, when done thoughtfully and intentionally, I think that this does lead to some of these moments of self-discovery and reflection. Like I said, highest leverage questions you want to use, especially depending upon what data you're looking at. If it's, like something like a map data or, like a Dibbles data, when we have some, key times for looking at the data and then some, moments in between we're doing some small assessments versus if you were looking at like a chapter assessment or a like a in-class assessment, like a do now or exit ticket, something that's quick. So kind of want to know what you're looking at in order to dive in to what questions. So we have the big picture. I kind of spread them up into like big picture questions and then questions for inquiry. You can see just some of the examples here. One of my favorites questions to ask for like big picture is, how are the results in the different types of questions, multiple choice versus open-ended, reading, writing. I think that that's really important to pay attention to, just because we know that there are students who do well, depending upon what type of question it is. And I just like to see how are your high flying students, how are they doing on multiple choice and open-ended? How are they doing on short answer? And same with some of your, middle of the road students. Are they doing better with open-ended questions? Are we finding that they're kind of getting to it a little bit more? I think that it is able to, help us see a lot from those type of questionings. My favorite inquiry question, and I love to say this in meetings because it's kind of shifts the atmosphere a little bit, but what questions do kids do terribly on? Like, what questions did kids like all get wrong and they all chose the same wrong answer? Let's talk about that first. I just think it's a fun way to break the ice. I think it's a good way to kind of look at what's wrong, right? And see why it's wrong. And if the majority is doing this, then what is that saying? I also want to pause and say that a lot of our data platforms do this work for us in the reports that we pull. So it's also important to think about the questions that you're asking and what report are you using, because a lot of our platforms already answer these questions or give us the data for these questions. It's just all about pulling the right report. And then to that end, I would say too, being wise about what reports are you using. Let's not bring all of them, right? Like, let's bring the ones that matter for this meeting, especially because I know what questions I'm going to ask you. And it just helps the teachers as well not have to think so broad, but now begin to narrow in and narrow in. So now we are at the fun point of the meeting, right? Well, we've done a little bit of inquiry. We've looked through the data. We've had some questions. We've had some really great discussions. And so now it's the action steps, okay? And this can always go a couple of different ways. I just, from a structural and like logistics standpoint, I love to include action steps and next steps. I don't like to leave a meeting without having this. So it really means that I have to be a manager of my time because it's an opportunity for further dive and further reflection. Action steps as well, right? Puts that accountability right back on the table. And then it's also something that we can cycle into for the next meeting. So I mentioned earlier about our meetings being cyclical and the agenda really helping guide that. This is that component here. When you're identifying action step, I think it's important to identify, okay, what are we going to follow up on and why? And this also changes depending upon what your data point is and what your data window is, and who is taking ownership of each task, whatever if it's an instructional task, who is going to take ownership of it? If it's a resource or a PD opportunity, who is going to take ownership of it? And that also pulls in some of that culture piece that we talked about earlier. What is a proper timeline for following up? I always call this my first year question because I feel like my first year teachers that I've worked with are just like, I'll do it tomorrow. Yes, it's done. I got it, because they just want to be right. They want to be doing the right thing. They want to make sure they're making you happy. But it's okay to sometimes say, okay, guys, in order for us to really look at this, instructional strategy, assessment type, what's a timeline that makes sense? And it might not always be the next data meeting. And as data leads, I think we have to be comfortable with that. And I think that even culture, again, we might have to have that conversation with admin and saying, hey, if we really want this to be effective, we're going to need more than 2 weeks. We're going to need more than 7 days to really follow up on that. And then what instructional plan is happening based on the data? That is another action step as well. And sometimes that can be 2 action steps, right? So we have like a logistic action step, and then we have an instructional action step. But sometimes if you are looking at a data that is at a shorter window, and it is okay, so what are we going to do next week to, as far as instructional strategies or methods to kind of speak to the data that we're seeing. I feel like that's like a TBT type thing, right? Like you see it happening a little bit more often. So just kind of like, making sure that we're identifying if it's an instructional something that we're going to need to implement, or if it's like a logistical thing or something that we need to implement, and what our real timeline is for gathering and gleaning the data there. I like to just make sure that when we are talking about action steps as well, that we are not making it a task. Once again, tasks sometimes lead to one more thing I have to do, which then leads to stress, and then finally leads to it not happening. So when we're thinking about our action steps, if we are really making it dialogue, I can't stress that enough, and having conversations with teachers, so everybody's voice is, heard, instead of it's okay, well, this is what you guys need to do next week. All right, any questions? When there's voice in from every party that's involved, it typically yields to better results. Okay. So last thing to kind of really consider, last big hump, is the logistics. And this is the things that, might be out of your control. It might be the things that you have to kind of work around, or what I call like concrete blocks. And a lot of that we see at the school level, and even at our district level as well, just because we have meetings that are standing that we need to follow up with people by monthly or quarterly. So those are things that won't change. And so how do we kind of plan our data meetings around that? I think that these are things that we should be aware while we're planning, and name them as well, put them out there in order for us to continue to make the best use of our time, our planning moving forward. So our time management is one big thing. What I like to do is, on my agenda, I like to keep a time of how long things should be. That holds me accountable more so than anybody else, because I can go. I'm a data nerd. I love it. I loved it as a teacher. So I can talk forever. But when I have for myself time points on the agenda, that's something that's able to help me kind of guide my time and, make sure that we're staying on task. So we're getting to each of the components of the agenda. Time management is also like, how often do your teams meet? Who meets when? Who meets most? Looking at your teams as well, like what are those teams made of? When we think about vertical planning, that's another thing that comes into it. If we want a vertical team, what needs to happen in order for that all to come together? How can we manage time that's already in our day and in our schedule to create those opportunities? Administration requirements, I feel like we all have them. Knowing those ahead of time can be helpful. I like to come in and talk to my admin teams and just say, hey, you know, what are your things that are on the table? What are your teachers doing that they have to do for you? And that helps me once again when I'm planning action steps. Okay, well, I know that teachers are already doing this weekly for their, you know, their admin. So how can I kind of leverage that or get in on that, you know? Location and space, location and space, location and space. Ideally, you have a room or a space that is committed to data. I love having, you know, tabs and colored Post-it notes on the wall. I love moving kids visually. I love changing a kid from a red Post-it note to a green Post-it note. And so that is ideal, right? But I also know that sometimes we are, you know, in an atrium meeting for our data team, you know, and so knowing and being aware of those things and just kind of making the best of it or planning before it for it. You know, my teams that we're meeting in an atrium, so I have a wheeled whiteboard that I take with me, and so instead of, you know, putting things on the wall, I put them on Post-it note size poster paper. Best thing ever, and stick it up there. Then I can roll it up and then roll it back up when I need to. So all of those things kind of matter when you're about the space. Roles in the meeting. You know, I feel like people feel differently about this, assigning roles in the meeting. I also feel like sometimes when we assign roles, they're just kind of like fluff roles, like I'm the timekeeper, or, you know, I'm the lookout to make sure no one comes in and interrupts our meeting. So if you are a role person who enjoys having roles in the meetings, thinking about what those roles are, and how can they effectively you know, help our data meetings. So if you assign somebody the agenda, making sure that that person is okay with sending the agenda out a couple of days before, or maybe you have someone who is like a ask and answer question. I've done that with some districts that are a little bit larger, and you know, it's intense for me to get 75 different emails, but if I get one email from one person with 75 different questions, I can manage that way better. So just thinking about what you need as a data lead, that would help you and how you can assign those roles. When you think like that, it's now no longer like a role in the meeting, like I'm the pencil collector, I'm the highlighter girl, but it's roles that affect our process, right? So having someone who's responsible for the agenda, make sure that we're able to have an agenda. Someone who's emailing questions to me, you know, that gives me just one person that I'm paying attention to and looking for emails from, then everybody. Nothing gets lost in the sauce. And then finally, establishing meeting norms. I do think that this is something that should happen in the beginning of the year or as close to your first data meetings as possible. Just like in our classrooms when we're doing morning meetings and we establish rules for our classroom or norms for our morning meeting times, this is important as well. And it's important that everybody has buy-in and everyone has say in what these norms are. Please do not come and say, these are my norms for my meeting. Have you read them? Great, let's go. You know, you come with your one, come with your one thing, and present it to the group, and then, you know, have them, and that could be even in your agenda beforehand. Think about what your one thing is that you need as a norm for your meeting, so you can be present and you can be effective partner in the meeting, and share that and have that conversation. That's always a good like first meeting before you start digging into beginning of the year things. So those are just some of the logistics. And as you think about your line of work and who you work with, these things might change. You might be able to add in more. Your logistics might be a little bit different. But I really just think it's important that you name them and you're very aware of them. One that I have for myself that's not on here, travel between 9 different schools, which is why I have one person emailing me because I travel between 9 different schools. And so I have to think logistic travel time, you know, what it means to get from one side of the city to the other side of the city and then back over to another side of the city. I'm not typically at my desk a lot. So, you know, something else for me is email works better. Texting if it's urgent, because I'm not going to see a voicemail until the end of my day, you know. So those are just things that you would want to think about and consider. Finally, we have our next best steps. And our next best steps now is where do we go from here? Okay. So we've talked about a lot, we've discussed a lot. You still might have some lingering questions, and then you might have been led to now think reflectively in some other areas in your practice, and that's great. What do we do next? What would you suggest that I do now? I've heard your presentation and I'm moving and I'm thinking about next year. So, one of my things that I think is, identifying an agenda style that will work best for your meetings. I know I've pushed that a lot, but I just think that that really just kind of, just creates the headway for a really, really strong meeting. It's your prep work, it's your teacher prep work, finding an agenda style that works for best for you. Second, I would say, and this is not on the slide, the first one was, but the second one is not on the slide, but I do in earnest feel like it's a next best step. Think about your logistics. Think about your logistics first, because that's going to guide a lot of what your actual meeting looks like. Write them out. I do. I have a page in my notebook and I just have them all written out. And then I even have them written out by school because not, like I said, I have 9 different schools. Not every school has the same situation. And so there are some situations that are very fluid and flexible. There are some situations that are a little bit more structured and rigid. Cool. I identify them. I know them. I'm very much aware of them. Third, that I would say is the next best step, and it's actually second on this slide, is go through those reflection questions. Get your reflection questions together. I've got about 5 go-to questions that I can pop off and I can, ask at a moment's notice, so even if I'm just working one-on-one with a teacher, or a teacher comes to me and just wants to look at some data questions, I've got my 5 go-to that typically work in most situations. And those are questions that I feel comfortable with. Those are also questions that I feel comfortable with follow-up, right? So I can ask them based on the answer. I'm able to give some great follow-up questions around that, and then, be able to move from there. So that would be my top 3 next best steps. Identify an agenda style that works best for you. Write out your logistics, and then go through your reflection questions and get comfortable and familiar with them. The more that you're comfortable asking them, the more that I think comfortably they are received. Also, next best step, think about what you can implement today. What can you do now? And then what are some things that you would have to meet with some people in order to be able to do forward? Like I said, I meet with my admin team, so there are some things that I can do now, just general. And then there are some things that I have to ask specific schools. Okay, hey, can I do this? What does this look like? What's your focus? Buy-in, it's a culture piece. Talking to admin and trying to get their focus for the year sometimes can really help you later on, when you have something that you want to do, because you're able to tie it in with that buy-in that they said that they wanted when you met with them. Meet with them beginning of the year, check in maybe in January, and then maybe one good time right before, the end of the year. Ideally is great. But if you're checking every so often too, I think that just creates a culture, that this person can be helpful and this person is not here to, be another thing I need to worry about, but actually be a partner with my school. So that is what I have for you. If you have any lingering questions, please write them in the chart or in the chat. Sorry, my email information is also here. And I think we're a little past 1:20. Sorry about that. But if we have some time, if you have a question you'd like to ask now, I'm here for it. Other than that, thank you so much for joining. It's been great to talk to you about something that I really love. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day and just stay safe and be well.